Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to be going over a little bit of MMA news because it pertains to Joe Rogan, and I'm a fan of both. I'm a fan of MMA and I'm a fan of Joe Rogan. So why not talk about this really bad article from Bloody Elbow? It's an editorial. I'll go ahead and link the archive link in the description below, because why would we give them a click on their website when they're writing such terrible pieces like this, right? When they have somebody, I should say, writing such a terrible editorial as this. But as you can see from the title, it says editorial, UFC 266 show Joe Rogan can and should be replaced. Okay. Now, from that, some people would probably infer, is this guy trying to say, is he trying to lobby for Joe Rogan to get fired? Maybe, maybe not. Let's not jump to that conclusion. Let's see what he has to say, this MMA journalist. Let's see what he has to say. Prior to UFC 266, there was a minor uproar. It seemed as if some fans thought the event wouldn't have a big pay-per-view feel, or that it would be missing something when the event came to a close. When the event came to a close, that talk had been whisked away to wherever hysterical histrionics go to die. The big deal that was going to ruin the fight card, which featured 2 title fights and a rematch between Nick Diaz and Robbie Lawler, was the absence of Joe Rogan. Yes, that's right, the non-attendance of a man who is often mocked for his overly theatrical screams and inability to call when a fight might be over was going to ruin the UFC 266 pay-per-view. I would really love to see some empirical data to back that claim up, but maybe this person's just being sarcastic, right? It's just a hyperbolic thing that they're saying right now. Yeah, and it's interesting that he said a man who is often mocked for his overly theatrical screams and inability to call when a fight might be over. I think you're referring to Mike Goldberg, and Mike Goldberg hasn't worked for the UFC for many years at this point. Shockingly, that did not happen. I saw no post-fight longings for Rogan's presence. If anyone ripped their garments apart and ranted to the heavens, if only Joe Rogan had been on the call, I missed it. Rogan's absence was a non-factor. Had the news not been announced beforehand, perhaps some eyebrows would have risen at the start of the broadcast, but that's probably the most that would have happened. Okay, I mean, I think that's fair to say, right? Not the other stuff. The other stuff is a little over the top, but let's continue on here. All this is to say that Rogan, who has missed 2 UFC pay-per-view dates in a row, one for his comedy tour and most recent for a hunting trip, is replaceable. I would go as far as to say that Rogan ought to be replaced. Okay, so maybe he has a good reason to back that up. Let's see what he has to say. Rogan might have just become the longtime employee the boss loves, but who other workers side-eye with resentment. Sounds like an assumption, because if this person had actually talked to somebody in the UFC, surely they would have said, my anonymous source in the UFC tells me that a lot of people resent Joe Rogan. But this is just an assumption, which is fine. It's an editorial. It's an opinion piece. You know, he's welcome to that opinion, even though it's probably not based in any kind of, with anything that could possibly be substantiated. But that's just my opinion though, right? He's the guy who shows up late, leaves early, does the least amount of work possible, gets the highest amount of pay, and reaps the big rewards. Okay, so a couple things here. How do you know he shows up late? How do you know he leaves early? Are you there? I mean, have you talked to somebody that could substantiate any of these claims that you're making? Because it seems like, again, this is just your opinion, that you're not really basing off anything tangible. So how do you know? How do you know he's showing up late? How do you know he's leaving early? Does the least amount of work possible. How do you qualify that? I would really love to know where this person gets off saying doing the least amount of work possible gets the highest amount of pay and reaps the biggest rewards. Well, I mean, he has been with the company for many years at this point, and he does have a celebrity status. So he's a guy that does have value to the company. So, and you say he does the least amount of work possible. I'd really love to know what you're basing that on, especially considering in the early days of the UFC, for many years, I would say up until the Fox deal, it was all Mike Goldberg and Joe Rogan carrying the commentary on their backs. And even back then, Joe Rogan talked about how much he was burnt out by all that. So I think he's put in plenty of work. While the other members of the UFC commentary team put in the work all week to prepare for a big event, not to mention also covering Tuesday events at the UFC Epics, Rogan's doing well something else. So obviously this person is referring to the fact that Joe Rogan does his podcast, which is very successful, as well as the fact that Joe Rogan has a career outside of the UFC. See, Joe Rogan has a celebrity outside of the UFC. Obviously, for his work on Fear Factor, he also is a comedian. He was also on a sitcom, I believe it was Radio News or something like that, back in the 90s. So, I mean, the guy had a bit of a celebrity status prior to him working for the UFC. But, yeah, he does do some other things outside of just working for the UFC. So while Jon Anik is nailing down the proper pronunciations of the fighter names and helping the other members of the commentary team get background information on the fighters, their families, and their camps, Rogan is elsewhere. It's interesting that he brings up Jon Anik because Jon Anik also has a podcast, and to the best of my knowledge, there's things that he also does just outside of just commentating for the UFC, although I know that is his primary job. And here's the thing. Joe Rogan also has followed fighters' backgrounds and has information on their backgrounds and has even said as much on his commentary. He's talked about the history of some of these fighters. So he does get himself informed on these fighters. Okay, you act just because you make the assumption that Jon Anik is the only one doing this doesn't mean that Rogan also isn't doing this. You seem to forget that Rogan is also very much a fight fan and watches other things outside of mixed martial arts like kickboxing and boxing and even some wrestling. He watches Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So to say that he's not properly looking into these backgrounds, you don't know that. You know, this is a guy that, by his own admission, is a huge fight fan, loves combat sports. Specifically, mixed martial arts is his favorite, but loves other combat sports as well. But I digress. Another thing to consider is the one-sided commitment between the UFC and Joe Rogan. The promotion wants Rogan to show up maybe 12 weekends a year to do his job. Rogan can't even commit to the light workload, as we found out with him skipping the past 2 pay-per-view cards. It seems to me as if the UFC isn't a priority in Rogan's life any longer. Okay, I would really love to know when it was that you saw Joe Rogan's contract to see what is the minimum weekends that are in his contract, that he's the ones that he is contractually obligated to show up to. I would really love to know where you got that particular information, because I'm willing to bet you don't have that information. Pretty sure that you don't have that information, because I'm pretty sure that's confidential information between Joe Rogan and the UFC, unless Joe Rogan himself has talked about it, which I don't believe he has, and that's really nobody's business. I think as long as he's fulfilling his obligations, whatever that agreement is that he has with the UFC, I think that's all that really matters. And considering the fact that for years, Joe Rogan and Mike Goldberg had only themselves to rely on when it came to commentary, I think he's earned the right to take it a little bit easy, considering how long he's been with the company. Yeah, that's just my opinion. But let's continue on here. And hey, that's fine. Priorities change. I'm sure doing the same thing over a number of years can get boring for someone who has the means to do whatever they want any day of the year. But if most of us told our bosses the days we were going to work and then decided, you know what, on second thought, I'm going to skip today, odds are good they would replace us and we would deserve it. You would deserve it if you offer nothing to the company. If you have no real value, if what you do is something that anybody could do, then you're expendable. If what you do is not all that unique, then yeah, you're probably going to get replaced. If what you do is literally something that a monkey could do, then yeah, you're probably going to get replaced. Yeah, you probably are going to be expendable. Rogan offers nothing that Paul Felder or Michael Bisping can't do and don't already do. Really? Interesting. Your opinion, that's fine. But Rogan, you probably didn't know this about Rogan, but or maybe you did, and you're just purposely choosing to gloss over it. Joe Rogan is a martial artist himself who has competed in martial arts tournaments. Now, while he hasn't competed in mixed martial arts, he has competed in combat sports himself, in Taekwondo and I believe karate matches. So he has experience in competition and in martial arts, also has trained in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and has also trained with several MMA fighters. So he's a guy that could provide insight regarding competition within martial arts, okay, as well as being a martial artist himself in practicing other disciplines. So I think there's value in that, absolutely. And considering the fact that he's had many years to hone his craft, I think that he's a unique voice within the commentary team because of it. And that's why he's had so much longevity in the company. If you recall, years back when the UFC was bought by, I believe the company, when they were bought out, the person that was fired was Mike Goldberg, not Joe Rogan. So they obviously saw value enough in Joe Rogan to keep him on. And I'll go even a step further than that. And this is just my opinion, okay? I like Mike Goldberg. He kind of grows on you. But if I'm being honest, in my opinion, okay, Joe Rogan carried that commentary team. There was times where Joe Rogan would have to correct Mike Goldberg, who was the play-by-play commentator. Joe Rogan, of course, being the color commentator, he would have to correct Mike Goldberg on things. And this happened several times. And I think even Mike Goldberg would admit that Joe Rogan, for a long time, if not till the very end of Mike Goldberg's tenure with the UFC, carried that commentary team and did so for many years and was burnt out. When the UFC ended up on Fox, that's when more people started to do commentary. And Joe Rogan and Mike Goldberg weren't spread so thin anymore. Okay? Joe Rogan hustled, not just in the UFC, but outside of the UFC, but really hustled within that company. Okay? The other thing that this writer is failing to see regarding Joe Rogan and his place in the UFC, okay, is the fact that Joe Rogan is one of the names that is synonymous with the UFC at this point that is not an active fighter on the roster. And that's something that this person doesn't seem to correlate here, okay? So Rogan offers plenty, I think, to the UFC. His name value offers plenty to the UFC. It legitimizes UFC just as much as the UFC legitimizes him. It's a very symbiotic relationship. Like I said, when you think of the UFC, of people that aren't active fighters on the roster, the names that probably come up in people's minds, there's three names that probably come to people's mind the most. Dana White, Joe Rogan, Bruce Buffer. So he has plenty to offer. So he says, Rogan offers nothing that Paul Felder and Michael Bisping can't do and don't already do. I disagree. In fact, these two who work a lot more than Rogan on UFC broadcasts might be better suited to the job of color commentator because they are former UFC fighters and can speak of what the fighters are going through in all facets of the fight game. It's funny that you said UFC fighters and not MMA. They're mixed martial artists. Okay? They're mixed martial artists. Now, granted, before they retired, they exclusively fought for the UFC, but they're mixed martial artists first and foremost. And while Joe Rogan himself might have not competed in mixed martial arts, okay, he has competed in martial arts and is a martial artist himself. Just like a lot of these fighters, before they became mixed martial artists, a lot of them also competed in other forms of martial arts. Okay? I don't think that Joe Rogan, not having been an MMA fighter himself, has any relevance to what he's able to provide in commentary, especially considering that he's a comedian and an actor. He's a guy that's used to speaking publicly and is a very good orator. So I think him being in commentary is perfect for him. It's just my opinion, though. Okay? So he says, better suited the job of commentary because they are former UFC fighters and can speak to what fighters are going through in all facets of the fight game. So can Joe Rogan as a competitor and having trained with plenty of mixed martial artists himself. Okay, no one's going to buy a UFC pay-per-view because Joe Rogan is absent. That's a fair point, and I would actually agree with that, because when you pay to watch a mixed martial arts event, you're paying to see who's on the fight card, first and foremost. That's the whole point of going. If you're going live, you obviously can't hear the commentary. And I'm sure there is some people, like I said before, that probably do prefer Joe Rogan and may actually decide whether or not they're going to order a pay-per-view based on the fact that Rogan is commentating that night or not. But by and large, that's not what happens. So, and if Rogan can't give the UFC a handful of weekends a year, it's time to reward the hard work folks like Bisping and Felder are doing and let them have Rogan's job. That's how it would work in the real world, so why not in the UFC? When somebody has been around for a long time and has put in that work, a lot of times, depending on the company, either one of two things happens. Either you get many more responsibilities as you move up the ladder, or you moved up to a point where you get a little bit more leeway. And that's how it works in the real world, depending on what company you work for and what position it is that you're in. And I think Rogan's in one of those positions where he's worked his butt off enough that he can get a little bit of leeway. And his name has value and adds something to the UFC. Just like him being a part of the UFC adds something to him as well. So I think this is a bad take. I think this is a very narrow-minded view of the situation. And I think it's a little bit dishonest. So this article absolutely disgusts me. I think that it is a terrible take, in my opinion. And I think it might have more to do with the fact that this person probably disagrees with the things Joe Rogan says and does outside of the UFC. And that's why this article exists. I don't think it has anything at all to do with what Joe Rogan is doing. Joe Rogan is good at what he does. He's good at what he does. And he's honed his craft over the years. And most people know that, especially longtime UFC fans. Now, is there people that I would say are better at this job than Joe Rogan? Absolutely. In my opinion, Mauro Ranallo. But Joe Rogan by no means is any kind of a slouch. And he's earned the right to have some leeway in this company that he's dedicated a lot of his time and a lot of his effort into, to the point where initially he wasn't even getting paid for doing what he does. So I'll leave it at that. Let me know what y'all think in the comment section below. Until next time, y'all know how it goes. The hunt continues.